Who wrote the Bible? Before the printing press, before paper, before ink as we know it, there were only words, stories whispered in the night, sung around fires, carried from generation to generation, words that would one day become the Bible. But who actually wrote these words? Who held the pen? The answer is more complicated than you might think. For centuries, tradition has held that Moses, the great prophet, the lawgiver, wrote the first 5 books: Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. These books, known as the Torah, are considered the foundation of the Hebrew Bible. But is this the full story? Modern scholars believe the origins of these texts are far more layered, far more ancient, and far more mysterious. Instead of a single author, the first books of the Bible may have been written by multiple hands across different times, shaped by wars, exiles, and political struggles. Scholars point to what they call the documentary hypothesis, the idea that 4 major sources were combined to form what we now know as the Torah. Each source had its own style, its own theology, its own purpose. The Yahwist, J, wrote of a personal, intimate God. The Elohist, E, described visions and dreams. The Deuteronomist, D, gave laws and warnings. And the priestly writer, P, recorded rituals, genealogies, and structure. And here's the fascinating part. Sometimes these sources tell the same story, but with differences. But before these words were ever written down, they were spoken, passed from father to son, from prophet to disciple, for centuries. Imagine the responsibility, keeping sacred knowledge alive without a single written word. Over time, words were carved into stone, written on papyrus, and eventually bound into scrolls. But as any historian will tell you, words evolve, stories shift. The scribes who recorded these texts weren't just copying, they were interpreting, shaping, refining. So, how do we separate history from myth? Archaeologists have uncovered tablets, scrolls, and inscriptions that confirm elements of the biblical world, but they've also raised new questions. Take, for example, the Merneptah stele, carved by an Egyptian pharaoh over 3,000 years ago. It contains the earliest known mention of Israel in recorded history, proof that an Israelite people existed. But how does this match with the biblical timeline or the Dead Sea Scrolls? Fragments of scripture over 2,000 years old. Some of these scrolls contain passages nearly identical to the Bible we have today. Others contain books that were left out entirely. The Bible, as we know it, wasn't set in stone. It was shaped by time, tradition, and countless hands. The oldest books were written in Hebrew. Later texts were added in Aramaic. And by the time of the New Testament, Greek had become the dominant language. With each translation, each adaptation, meanings shifted. Words took on new connotations. And so, the Bible grew, not just as a religious text, but as a living historical document. So who wrote the Bible? The answer isn't simple. It wasn't just one man on a mountaintop. It was a tapestry of voices across centuries, shaping a story that still defines faith today. And even now, new discoveries are still being made. Every year, archaeologists uncover pieces of this grand puzzle: inscriptions, scrolls, lost texts that deepen our understanding. Perhaps the greatest biblical discovery has yet to be found. Perhaps it's one of the lost cities in the Bible. Chapter 2, The Lost Cities of the Bible. For thousands of years, the Bible has spoken of mighty cities, fortresses that fell, civilizations that vanished, and kingdoms that shaped history. But can archaeology prove they existed? Were these stories fact or legend? Let's begin with one of the oldest cities on earth, Jericho. According to the book of Joshua, its walls came tumbling down after the Israelites marched around it for 7 days. A miraculous event, but could history confirm it? In the 1930s, British archaeologist John Garstang excavated Jericho and claimed to have found evidence of massive destruction, which he linked to the biblical conquest. But decades later, another archaeologist, Kathleen Kenyon, disagreed. Her findings suggested that Jericho's walls had fallen centuries before Joshua would have arrived. So, what's the truth? While scholars debate the timeline, one fact remains. Jericho was a fortified city that faced violent destruction. Whether by war, earthquake, or something else entirely, the ruins tell a story of a powerful city that once stood and then was no more. Now, let's turn to a story far more dramatic: the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah. According to Genesis, these cities were consumed by fire and brimstone as divine judgment. But could this really have happened? Some scientists believe the story may be rooted in real events. In 2021, researchers published a study suggesting that an ancient city near the Dead Sea, possibly the site of Sodom, was destroyed by a massive airburst, similar to the Tunguska explosion in 1908. At Tal el Hammam, excavations have uncovered evidence of extreme heat, pottery that melted into glass, human remains shattered by a massive shockwave. Could this be the smoking gun that links biblical Sodom to a real cataclysmic event? The debate continues. Was this the wrath of the heavens, or a cosmic disaster that later became legend? For centuries, some historians doubted the very existence of King David. Without solid archaeological proof, many believed he was a literary creation, a mythical king, rather than a historical figure. Then, in the 1990s, everything changed. Excavators at Tel Dan unearthed a broken stone slab from the 9th century BCE, an inscription that mentioned the House of David. Suddenly, history had something concrete. David was not just a legend, his dynasty was real. But how grand was his kingdom? Some scholars argue that David was a small tribal leader, rather than a mighty king ruling over a vast empire. Others believe his Jerusalem was a thriving centre of power, just as the Bible describes. The truth, still buried beneath the city's foundations, waiting to be revealed. Jericho, Sodom, Jerusalem, these are just the beginning. Archaeologists believe that countless more biblical cities remain undiscovered, waiting for the sands of time to reveal their secrets. With every discovery, we rewrite history. We challenge what we thought we knew, and we bring ancient stories, once thought to be myth, into the realm of reality. So, what else is out there? What cities remain buried beneath the earth, and what will they tell us about the history of the Bible? Chapter 3. The Dead Sea Scrolls. Sometimes, the greatest discoveries happen by accident. In 1947, a young shepherd wandered these very cliffs, searching for a lost goat. But what he found would change everything. Buried within these jars were the most important biblical manuscripts ever discovered, the Dead Sea Scrolls. Imagine this, over 900 scrolls, containing some of the oldest known copies of the Hebrew Bible, texts that predate any other biblical manuscript by 1,000 years. But these scrolls weren't just copies of familiar stories. They also contained texts that had been left out of the Bible entirely. Some of these texts were early versions of biblical books like Isaiah, Psalms, and Deuteronomy, almost identical to the versions we know today. Others were completely unknown, writings from a mysterious Jewish sect that had vanished long before the New Testament was written. One of the most remarkable finds was the Great Isaiah Scroll, a complete version of the Book of Isaiah, over 1,000 years older than any previously known copy. And here's the shocking part. It was nearly identical to the modern version. This proved something scholars had debated for centuries, that the biblical text had been remarkably well preserved. But who wrote them? Who went to such lengths to hide these scrolls, and why? Most scholars believe the answer lies with a secretive group known as the Essenes. The Essenes were an apocalyptic Jewish sect that lived in isolation near the Dead Sea. They believed the world was ending. They saw themselves as the sons of light fighting against the sons of darkness. They wrote their own religious texts, stored them in caves, and vanished from history after the destruction of the Second Temple in 70 CE. Many believe they hid these scrolls to protect them from the invading Romans, and in doing so, preserved some of the most important religious texts in human history. But here's where things get really interesting. Among these scrolls were books that never made it into the Bible, texts like the Book of Enoch, the War Scroll, and the Temple Scroll. These books describe visions of heaven, cosmic battles, and a radically different version of Jewish law. The Book of Enoch, for example, describes a group of fallen angels known as the Watchers who came down to earth, taught humanity forbidden knowledge, and created a race of giants. This story didn't make it into the official Bible, but traces of it exist in the Book of Genesis, where it briefly mentions the Nephilim. Could the Book of Enoch be an earlier version of this story? And if so, why was it left out? Before the discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls, scholars only had medieval copies of the Old Testament to study. Many assumed that the text had been edited over time, but the scrolls proved otherwise. Most of the biblical texts had remained incredibly accurate and consistent for over 1,000 years. Yet, at the same time, they also showed us a Bible that was still in development, with different versions of certain books, alternative psalms, and theological debates we never knew existed. These discoveries reshaped our understanding of early Judaism, the origins of Christianity, and how sacred texts were written, edited, and preserved. Even after decades of research, the Dead Sea Scrolls still hold secrets. Some texts remain untranslated. Others are so fragile they can barely be handled. And some believe that more scrolls remain hidden in the caves around Qumran, waiting to be discovered. What else is out there? What lost books of the Bible have yet to be found? And when we find them, how will they change what we think we know? Now let's get to something really interesting. Chapter 4. The Historical Jesus. 2,000 years ago, in a remote province of the Roman Empire, a man walked the earth, one whose words would reshape history. His name was Jesus of Nazareth. But who was he really? The world in which Jesus lived was a turbulent one, an era of political unrest, Roman occupation, and clashing religious ideologies. And yet, outside the Bible, historical records of him are surprisingly scarce. Let's start with the facts. Jesus is mentioned in historical records, but only briefly. Roman historian Tacitus, writing in the 2nd century, refers to Christus, who was executed under Pontius Pilate. Jewish historian Flavius Josephus, writing around the same time, acknowledges Jesus as a teacher and miracle worker. But is this enough? These records confirm that a man named Jesus existed, that he was crucified, and that his followers believed he had risen. But beyond that, the details become less clear. The Gospels, which tell us the most about him, were written decades later based on oral traditions, retellings, and theological perspectives. Here's where things get complicated. The Gospels are not just historical records, they are theological documents written by believers for believers. Each writer had a message, an audience, and an interpretation of who Jesus was. The earliest Gospel, Mark, was written 40 years after Jesus' death. Matthew and Luke came later, borrowing from Mark, but adding their own insights. John, written nearly 70 years after the crucifixion, presents a more spiritual, divine image of Jesus. So, how much of the Gospels is history, and how much is faith? But the story doesn't end there. Over time, other accounts of Jesus emerged, accounts that were later excluded from the official canon of the Bible. These are the lost Gospels, books like the Gospel of Thomas, the Gospel of Mary, and the Gospel of Judas. These Gospels paint a very different picture of Jesus. In the Gospel of Thomas, he is a teacher of hidden wisdom, offering cryptic sayings rather than dramatic miracles. In the Gospel of Judas, he is not betrayed. He entrusts Judas with a divine mission. And in the Gospel of Mary, it is Mary Magdalene, not Peter, who understands his true teachings best. These texts were declared heretical by early church leaders. They were buried, burned, forgotten, until centuries later they were rediscovered, challenging what we thought we knew about Jesus and his message. So, who was the real Jesus? A radical teacher? A political revolutionary? The Son of God? The truth is, he was many things to many people. To some, he was a prophet. To others, a Messiah. And, to the Roman Empire, a threat. His crucifixion was meant to erase him. Instead, it made him immortal. His followers spread his message, turning his life into legend, his words into scripture, his story into the foundation of the world's largest religion. But the story of Jesus is still being written. Every new archaeological discovery, every newly uncovered manuscript adds another layer to the mystery. What if more lost gospels are waiting to be found? What if new discoveries challenge everything we think we know? And what if the historical Jesus is still waiting to be fully uncovered? History and faith have always walked hand in hand, but history keeps evolving. The question is, what will we discover next? Chapter 5: Unsolved Mysteries. For centuries, the Bible has been a source of faith, a historical document, and a treasure map of unsolved mysteries. Even after countless discoveries, hidden scrolls, lost cities, forgotten gospels, there is still more. Secrets buried beneath the sands of time, artifacts waiting to be found, questions that remain unanswered. What's still out there, waiting to be uncovered? And how might it rewrite everything we think we know about the Bible? One of the greatest biblical mysteries is the Ark of the Covenant, an object so sacred that, according to legend, it carried the very presence of God. But where is it now? The Ark vanished from history after the destruction of Solomon's temple in 586 BCE. Some believe it was taken to Babylon. Others claim it was hidden beneath the Temple Mount, never to be seen again. But the most intriguing theory: for centuries, Ethiopian monks have claimed that the Ark rests within the Church of St. Mary of Zion. But no one, not even scholars, has been allowed to see it. Could it still be there, hidden in the heart of Africa? Mount Sinai, the place where Moses received the Ten Commandments, a defining moment in biblical history. But where did it really happen? For generations, Jebel Musa in Egypt has been considered the sacred mountain, but now some believe the real Mount Sinai is not in Egypt at all, but in Saudi Arabia. Jebel al-Lawz, a mountain with a summit that appears mysteriously burned, a rock formation resembling the split rock of Horeb, and ruins that some claim match the biblical description of an Israelite encampment. Could this be the real Mount Sinai? The tomb of Jesus, one of the holiest sites in Christianity. But here's the mystery: we don't just have one tomb, we have three. The Church of the Holy Sepulchre has been revered as Jesus' burial site for over 1,600 years. But some believe the simpler garden tomb, outside the city walls, is more authentic. And then there's a controversial discovery: the Talpiot tomb. In 1980, archaeologists discovered an ancient tomb in Talpiot, near Jerusalem, containing ossuaries, bone boxes, inscribed with names like Jesus, son of Joseph, and Mary. Some claim this is Jesus' actual family tomb. Others dismiss it as a coincidence. If proven true, this discovery would challenge the very foundation of Christian belief. But is this really the tomb of Jesus, or just another mystery that deepens the intrigue? But these aren't the only mysteries. What about the lost tribes of Israel? Where did they go? Could there be more Dead Sea Scrolls still waiting to be found? And what about the rumoured Gospel of Jesus? A manuscript said to contain Jesus' own words, yet never discovered. Even now, the earth holds its secrets. Beneath the sand, beneath the ruins, beneath the layers of time, answers may still be waiting. The Bible is more than a book, it's a story still being written, and maybe the greatest discovery is still out there, waiting to be uncovered. What will we find next? The Bible isn't just a book, it's a gateway, a portal to civilizations long gone, to voices that still speak, to mysteries that have yet to be unraveled. Every stone unearthed, every artifact found, every scroll deciphered, rewrites what we thought we knew. It challenges our understanding. It fills in the gaps of history. And yet, what if the greatest biblical discovery hasn't been found yet? What will we discover next? If you enjoyed this video, please consider subscribing to Bible Short Stories for more engaging content.